I've been teaching all week, so it's just getting a little tired at the end of the week. How's that? Okay. I'll try not to yell into it. Feeding intolerance. All right. I haven't gotten another job since I saw you. All right. So we're back outside that bedside. Rounds are starting. And the question we may be asking now is, why isn't my baby tolerating my own milk or my own feeding or what the nurses are feeding and what the doctors have written? How could the baby not be tolerating it? What does that mean? Well, I love that feeding intolerance is now being called FI. You just talk with people and say, well, how's the FI going today? Feeding intolerance. And I always like to start this off a little bit with my group that I'm with. How do you in your unit define what feeding tolerance is? What is the baby doing whenever it finally says to you, I'm going to go tell somebody this baby's having feeding intolerance?
Residuals.
Residuals?
Increase abdominal circumference.
Increase abdominal girth? Loose stools? Yeah.
Emesis.
Emesis? We are looking for some kind of clear, definitive marker that's a clinical sign that is diagnostic of the intolerance. What happens sometimes with the things that all of us said, and I've said it my whole life, is that yes, something's happening here, but I don't always can make the case that it's absolutely causal by the intolerance. What if it's a little bit of GERD? What if it's a little of, it's Monday and I had a wild night in the NICU kind of thing, and I had too much fun with the other preemies and now I'm not feeling well. So what we're going to talk about today is how do we get a little bit better in capturing in our diagnosis. All of those things that you've mentioned have all been mentioned in the literature. I had one which is, let me tell you, if I'm on call as an NNP and I get a call from a nurse saying, can you come look at this baby, he's not looking right, I am blowing out the door. To me, that is a diagnosis all by itself. He is not looking right. I'm not sure what it is, but it's not how he has been. Okay? How often do you think it occurs in your unit? Do you have a sense of that? Every shift? Occasionally? Huh? Do you have somebody you're watching or you're a little bit more cautious about? Do you ever see it cycle? The baby will have a day and then he's good for a while, then he starts all over again? Yeah. And then sometimes he and his friends decide they're going to have a day, and then they all feel better the next day. And we see these very legitimate clinical presentations, but there can sometimes seem like there's a lot of randomness associated to them. And at least if it's not this random, I know there's something going on, but I can't figure out what the causal element is. Why is it affecting the babies at that time? What are the symptoms? We talked about those. That one was always gets mentioned in first. And the one thing I want you to think about as we go through this are the definitions that you use in your setting measurable. And by that I mean, I can define it as this was an episode, and then this was an episode, so I can sort of quantify it, find a way to measure it and look at it so I know how often any one baby or how often we're seeing that process in our population. And then finally, are your clinical responses consistent based on what you're seeing? So does your unit handle every aspirate the same way, every abdominal girth the same way, I don't think he's looking right the same way, or could it change with who the provider is that day? Who's on, or what we've done lately, the beginning of the month, the end of the month, those kinds of things. Yeah, it is a crucial place because sometimes we'll stop feedings, sometimes we'll adjust feedings, sometimes we'll do a workup when we have this feeding intolerance. And yet, we still haven't strongly established exactly what that means. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some efforts to capture that a little better. This is a fabulous little, it's more of a commentary in 2012 talking about feeding intolerance, whereby the neonatologist, neonatal team often prescribe enteral nutrition as if walking on a tightrope between the purposed attainment of full enteral feeding and the fear of neck. So I know I have some RDs in this room today, where you're at the bedside going, gee, I think I'd like to increase his volume a little bit, but done this in the past, and I don't know, and yeah, it's you do, because there is something that I think is cellular in me. So I know this is true of me. And it has to do with a baby by the name of Sarah, who had just the most lovely family, was just the cutest little kid, and who was one of mine on my team in the Children's Hospital, and who I came on the day before and was talking to her parents how she is doing. I cannot go tell parents anymore how well their child is doing, because somehow the universe hears that, and then things begin to happen. She seems to be doing so good. She's back past birth weight. She's going great. Came back the next day, came on and got that, just something not right with Sarah today. And she was dead in 12 hours. Oh. And if you've ever seen that, and you're saying, oh, because you know that can happen, you just go, how could she be so good 24 hours before and then not? And what could we maybe have done different? And why didn't we, or did we try and it didn't work? So there's sometimes events in life that go past just memory or remembering or knowledge. Knowledge is a study, remembering is a case. It even goes past that. Sarah is cellularly like stuck in me somewhere. Every time I go look at a kid, I think, remember that could happen. If I get this call wrong, if I miss the call on this. I talked to you earlier about this idea that if we look at it from a physiologic point of view. From a physiologic point of view, we can do something whereas we think of feeding intolerance as the mildest case of NEC. And what I mean by that, I'm not trying to minimize NEC or catastrophize intolerance, but the physiology is probably still that same dysbiosis that we're recognizing now, where things are not right in the bowel, that there is some kind of physiologic stress, some kind of immune issue, an inflammatory process. And some maybe may have an isolated episode of intolerance or some low-grade intolerance that we as clinicians, and I appreciate somewhat, excuse me, particularly here, what Kelly was saying earlier, that we talk to our colleagues and try and figure out what would you do, what would I do, but we got through that. And then there's this awful event. There's this awful event, and we're always trying to figure out how do I make the right call at the right time to prevent that. So where that feeding intolerance, literally in a shift with one baby, exacerbates into NEC. And it's just going downhill very, very fast, in spite of any therapy we might think to do. We got taken over very much by surprise by the severity of the onset of this disease. So, we talked about this earlier, that's why I always do my second talk is going to be shorter than my first talk. These mucus layers, the epithelial layer, this area of what we call the lamina propria, and its role in protecting the gut wall here. NEC is always going to start here with the inflammation. It's going to break down the villi, a little standing up villi. It's going to penetrate through the bowel wall, and then it begins to translocate, and it devastates the continuity and the functional barriers in the bowel wall. Those factors that we see are pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. But in the case of necrotizing enterocolitis, we have an exacerbation of the pro-inflammatory state. And that these group of babies that you and I deal with every day are the ones who are most at risk. Those with the immature organ systems who have this lifelong existence in a hospital environment plagued by onslaught of bacteria and microbial agents that are detrimental. The role of their delivery, those cycles of hypoxemia and reperfusion, luminal starvation, and remember, most of that happens once feedings are initiated. It's usually the fed gut. And I'm not sure that it's the feeding as the fact that the baby's now been born, been very ill, has had a microbial onslaught for a day or two into life, or 3 days, or that first week, and then onsets. Luminal starvation with feeding coming again, that is inflammation, infection cycles. Very hard. You get bacterial cultures of stool are hard to obtain. If you can do genomic sequencing, you might get a little bit better in getting a diagnosis. But what you're going to see here is an infection inflammatory state, and then all is probably secondary to some insult or GI, whoop. Did I miss one? Did it get past me?
No.
No, okay, thank you. So again, the origin, we talked about, this is the model of nature. This is the baby who usually does well. In this case, a preterm baby, a lot of aberrant bacteria growing in the bowel, limited cellular immunity, limited intestinal immaturity, C-section adds to it with inflammation, antibiotic exposure, lack of enteral feeds, what we call luminal starvation, infant formula feeding first, seems to be an association, indwelling catheters. 10 minutes.
Terry, my second talk is a little shorter,
Okay,
so you just take your time.
thank you, honey. So anyhow, now I'm ready to start this one. Okay, so that was a lot of review. Thanks, Kevin. So, feeding intolerance. There are two names on here. Dr. Tiffany Moore, PhD nurse, Dr. Margaret Wilson. Dr. Margaret Wilson was my faculty advisor at the University of Florida for my thesis work. My thesis work was looking at what is the first clinical sign and symptom that a neonatal nurse would pick up on at the bedside for necrotizing enterocolitis. So I looked at things like gastric atrophy, abdominal distension, different things. I'll tell you now, it was not either one of those. It was two other things, okay? But non-specific findings are frequently associated with NEC and feeding intolerance. Non-standardized clinical significance, we talked about gastric, let me ask, gastric residual volumes. Who here are still using it? Interesting, yeah, okay. Interesting, because I'll show you some work on that. Abdominal distension, still measuring bellies? Everybody? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Most part, okay. Emesis, conflicting diagnosis. Visible loops of bowel, but now with a lot of our milder forms of ventilation, CPAP, high flow,
Right.
it's not uncommon to see the big loops there in the belly. It's sort of confounding the diagnosis. And then my favorite, not acting right. Okay. Well, the issue with feeding intolerance is where is it going to go and how will it affect the baby long term. So in feeding intolerance, if a baby has multiple episodes of that, what you're going to see is increased time to full feeding. If he's increasing his need of time to get to full feeding, he's going to increase his time with a line. He's going to increase his line with time with TPN. Now, they're financially costly, but they're physiologically costly. Eclampsia is a very high risk. Remember, the longer the gut is underfed and on TPN, it's not the TPN, it's the underfeeding. You get gut atrophy. You get gut atrophy. Remember I said how the brain is growing so fast during this period of time? And then Kelly came along after me and so accurately said, every organ is. There's gut atrophy. The gut's not growing at the rate it should to be the length it should. Its length determines its absorptive capability for later in life, and the bowel is smaller. So we thought for years it was the TPN itself. We think more and more now it has to do without being able to grow the gut adequately. Longer days to full feeds, which result in additional days of hospitalization, increased hospital costs. Pretty much a pretty vicious cycle that we see in our babies. The specific complications, increased mortality, increased morbidity overall, increased risk, we said, of eclampsia, increased risk of days of TPN, incidence of late onset sepsis, increased length of stay, increased cost of care. This is two that I found and added on from another article, suboptimal nutrient delivery. Okay. Enteric feeding is very, very efficient when it works. And TPN, while providing substrate, is at risk, and you may not get the growth nutrients and the enzyme situations that you need growing from being enterally fed. And then risk of long-term neurodevelopmental delay. So, individual interpretation of the signs of feeding intolerance represent one of the most uncontrollable variables in the early nutritional management of these infants, and may lead to that suboptimal nutrition, delayed attainment of full enteral feeding, and prolonged intravenous nutrition supply. None of those are what we want for that infant. We would like him to be able to feed enterally helps with his microbiome, helps with his development of his immune system, no longer a line in place and risk of sepsis. Okay? So, failure intolerance again. Now, Tiffany Moore is a PhD faculty member at the University of Nebraska. She and I sit together as members of National Perinatal Association Executive Board. Very active clinical researcher in the area of nursing intervention around feeding. Failure to reach full enteral feedings after a specific timeline. Okay? So this is the idea she says when I said, how do we make measurable definitions? Well, maybe on a certain timeline. That baby is on full feeds by a certain day after starting. Something that's measurable and it's not changeable. It's not something that's going to fluctuate by person to person. A day is still 24 hours. A feeding is this. It's something I can measure. It's not that, well, it might have been this or it may have been other. The number of interruptions or delays with enteral feedings in the process of reaching a full volume for enteral feed of the baby may be a better measurement. But no measure distinguished between nasogastric oral feedings or when determining the diagnosis of feeding intolerance. These concepts that she and Dr. Wilson looked at that had appeared in the literature were there, but none of them really were quite definitive enough for us to use it as a diagnosis. So my question then becomes, is there value in having the diagnosis of feeding intolerance tied to the recognized, standardized measurements, as well as a unit-specific feeding protocol? How many of you have a feeding protocol? Let me ask you another question. This comes out of the safety literature. How many of you have in your EMR, whichever system you're using, your feeding protocol coincides with your documentation? It pops right up on your screen and you're looking at it when you're in the feeding section. Okay? More and more, the safety groups are saying all of our policies and procedures should coexist and cross over with our electronic medical record. So it's a stimulus for us to remember to do it and to chart it at that time in light of what we say our policy is. Otherwise, the policy becomes something in a binder somewhere. It gets drug out when you get that overhead page, the Joint Commission is in the house. Visitor in the house. Visitor, I was in one place, Visitor J is in the house. Jay-Z? No, Joint Commission. And so what they did in this paper, and is another one that's hanging in my office all the time, I'm going to figure out something to do with it someday. They began to look and see, is there some place in the literature where people did just that? They used things that don't change, time, volume, those kinds of things. And right there, definition of that, something we'd all agree that 24 hours is 24 hours, 30 cc's is 30 cc's, Q3 hours is Q3 hours, whatever. Now, if you read much of the NEC literature, Dr. Patoli is extremely well published in the literature around necrotizing enteral colitis. And the definition from the work there is the inability to achieve a full enteral feeding volume of 140 mLs per kilo per day. Is that measurable? Absolutely, we can do it every single day around. Oh, we get 130, 120, 110, 150, whatever. 140 by 10 days. By 10 days. After the initiation of enteral feedings. Regardless, I don't care about your gestational or postnatal age. Okay? But you can get to there by 10 days. If you can't, then you have feeding intolerance. Now what I do about it may be very different baby to baby, depending on what they respond to. But I can call that a diagnosis. The reason the diagnosis is so important, and we're seeing it around, and ask Kelly about this, I'm sure she knows much more about it than I do. There are some words and concepts you and I use every day clinically that no one has as a diagnosis. One of those is malnutrition, which is a big issue right now. How can you not look at this baby? Whoop, that's my bigger baby. Some little 500-gram baby, and saying, okay, there's no malnutrition going on there. What about intolerance? How do we make a definition that then brings underneath it the code numbers that we need to care for it or to diagnose it? As opposed to when we have pneumonia, we have those. When I have RDS, I have those. What do I have that comes in under providing what I do financially in the form of care models of treatments to care for that. Okay? So that's the way we go. I cannot say this name, I have no idea how. I'm sure an absolutely brilliant soul. It's another definition they used. Feeding intolerance is determined by measuring the number of days. Are days measured? Absolutely, 24. Required for the infant to reach full enteral feedings, as well as the number of days required to regain their birth weight. That's all measurable. Every baby could be evaluated by that criteria. You couldn't separate anybody out because that's not what your criteria was going to be for feeding intolerance. The Cochrane Collaborative, which is what I call the Vaughan of the rest of the world, the Vaughan Network of the rest of the world, is defined as the number of days required for the infant to reach full enteral feeding without any parenteral nutrition. So the IVs are not running any longer. That's measurable. I can look at that. Do you see how then we can start, Kelly talks about gathering data, her expertise is in designing studies and looking at things. But if everybody who's working on any given day has a different definition of what feeding intolerance is, and I don't really know what it means, but if we don't, at least if we can say, we had 16 babies who could not get off DPN by a certain day, who could not regain birth weight by this date, a measurable standard, then we can quantify and look at those groups a little differently. Right now we tend to look at them as a one-off. Every baby sort of his own reference at that point. And this is the definition they came up with, or part of it. If you read the article, it's a longer definition. Feeding intolerance in the premature infant is the inability to digest enteral feedings, pay attention, and the disruption of the infant's feeding plan. He is off plan. Maybe that's the phrase we should use on Ralph. Instead of feeding intolerance, he's off plan. We gotta get him back on plan. Why isn't he on the plan? Baby over here is on plan. This baby is on plan. My kid in the other room is on plan. Why is this baby off plan? Okay. Then I can standardize what I will do to diagnose it or treat it, and we can probably get a much better idea of what's our incidence, how often it's happening in our place. If they're off plan, the plan didn't change. How did the baby change that time? It just may help with tightening up our understanding of feeding intolerance. So, about giving them some milk. That's the number one thing these days, give them some milk. Some people say it's the diet. So this is the exclusive human milk diet, if you're not familiar with it. And this diet is made exclusively with human milk-based product. It's a human milk-based product. All of the milk is a mother's own milk donated, okay? And out of that, the expectation with the diet is that babies would always receive their mother's own milk first unless there is some concern. Remember, mother's own milk has specificity around immune properties, antibodies. So we always want the baby to have mom's first. Second is donor human milk. The Academy of Pediatrics says it's a bridge. It's a bridge to mom. It's to fill in the volume that baby needs so mom can get her volume there. Mom, then donor. Third is to have a fortifier, and we have a tremendous explanation of the different fortification options we have out there. But this fortifier will be made with human milk, not with cow milk. And then the last one is what we call human milk split products. And that's when we can take components out of human milk that are nutritional components and make them available. In the case of that, we're talking something like a human milk cream or a human milk fat product to add additional calories. Okay? So, what do we know about that? Well, this is a study by Dr. Moasad, Melinda Elliott, and Abraham that was done in Baltimore, in a NICU there. They had 4 feeding groups in this particular study. Group H was the exclusively human milk-fed group. Group B was babies who got all human milk, and all they got different was a bovine or cow milk-based fortifier. Group M was, this is the one I refer to as eating in the nurse's locker room. Anything you could find, these kids got. You go back there and there's half a donut, bagel, you scratch and sniff, and that looks good, right? Especially on weekend nights, what can I say? So, human milk, bovine-based fortifier, formula, whatever we found, those kids got it. And in this particular study, there was a group of babies a little bit bigger who were able to be exclusively formula-fed with no other option. So, You have a unique group of kids here. I love Dr. Elliott. Her slide drives me crazy. I'm going to make it pretty. Okay? So the human milk group, what they're looking at is number of times. Times is measurable. Not aspirates, not GERDs, not he doesn't look right. How many times in a 24-hour period, okay, is the blue, the feedings were stopped? Okay, stop. You stop them for 12 hours or more, you have got to start doing something different. You can stop one feeding. You should have a line in. But we have 12, 24, 48 hours of stopping feeds. That's a big situation. So, in the human milk fed, 94% of the time, the feedings were stopped. You could feed through with that exclusive human milk diet. 6% of the time, feedings were stopped, but for 24-hour period. Bovine, these babies got a whole lot of human milk and just got a bovine fortifier. 66% of the time, they found, okay, that they didn't have to stop feedings for any reason. 17 and 17, 24 and 48 hours, it was stopped in that group that got human milk fortifier, HMF. Take a look over here. This is the mixed group. 37% never had their feeding stopped. 35%, 24 hours. 29%, 48 hours. And then look at the formula fed group. Not much different, I think, interestingly. Between the bovine fed group, they got human milk with just the fortifier. 66%, 27 and 7. So yeah, if my measurement in this case is let's have not stop feedings, then I may be doing better with that, okay? That's a way to measure it. Another way that they looked at it, you can pick any of these, whatever works for you. Additional days to full feeding. Our protocol is you'll be on full feedings by day 10. How many more than days of 10 did it take for you to get, to that feeding? They found that the bovine group, and this was, the 0 becomes the exclusive human milk diet, that's your reference group. Bovine, all human milk plus a fortifier, 9 days. The mixed, 10.27 days. This drives me crazy in her slide. The formula, 9.39 days. Days of hospitalization, I can measure days. The bovine group, all human milk, but a bovine fortifier. Look at the group that got a little bit of everything. 23 days just about. 3 weeks hospitalization longer. Now I can say, we as a unit have got to look at feeding intolerance. It's another 21 days on the bill, right? 21 days. But if I just keep saying, well, we had a couple kids last week or a kid the other day, I never really know what we're seeing. And then here, the formula fed group, 7.26 days. And then finally, additional hospital costs in that mixed group, $106,000. Okay. Bovine, $27,000. Formula, $29,000. But again, it becomes, I'm just trying to see how measurable, how it helps us maybe think of some better ideas on how to manage it. This is a very recent article on gastric residual volumes and abdominal girths, comparing the two. There's a whole lot of data in there you can read in this article, but looking at the primary outcome was going to be time to reach full feeds. They defined full feeds as 150 mLs per kilo per day. Secondary outcomes were length of stay, glasses up here. Length of stay, need for parental nutrition, episodes of feeding intolerance, number of feeds withheld, and sepsis were the others that they looked at. And they give you the data across the board, and the only places where things sort of stood out, which was a little bit interesting, was one on the birth weights. These were a little bit bigger babies, 1,300 grams, right? If you come down here, need for resuscitation. Those are going to be your sicker babies. But if you go then and look at the data, when you look at the gastric residual volumes measured against the abdominal girths, as to time to reach full feedings, episodes of feeding intolerance, number of feeds withheld, duration of hospital stay, duration of PN days of parental nutrition, sepsis, and neck, you get a little bit better understanding of what they're looking at. And what they came to an indecision of at the end of their article, the study said, what do we know? Well, they base on their findings that what we know is checking for gastric residual delays getting to full feeds. we're checking and we're looking and we're not sure what it means, so we sort of stop or slow down and don't progress. Now, we don't want to miss neck, don't get me wrong. Don't want to miss that, but it's not very predictive in telling us who to be concerned about. There is not enough robust evidence to suggest that increased gastric residual volume predicts neck at this time. It's something, but it's not necessarily predictive of neck, okay? And we're trying to find out who are the kids we need to adjust feeding to make allowances for. And abdominal girths measurements is safe, helps preterm neonates reach full enteral feedings. I want someone who is a crafty person. I want someone who goes to Hobby Lobby to stay home one weekend and make a non-movable, fixated, permanent abdominal girth measurement tape. In my mind, I have a picture of it, exactly how it would fit. It would, as so many of our things do, if you use very, very mild adhesiveness to keep it in place. It would be movable back and forth. We would measure in the same place every day. I had a friend that I talked to one time about making a snuggle-up developmental care thing for a baby, who went home and did that and made about $1 million, okay? So go make me one of these tape things and we will find someone to make it. And we still can't have agreement on how to. I can have an oscillator, I can have a jet. All I want is a measuring tape that stays in place to the baby's hospitalization, that I'm always measuring in the same place. They say what needs to be studied, the effect of abdominal girth measurement on hospital stay, infection rates in neck, and what we can do today, use those measurements to assess feeding intolerance and not check for gastric residual volume. Conduct trials with smaller, younger neonates. Remember, those babies were as high as 1,300 grams in this study. Some people say it might be the microbiome, might be part of the issue. The study groups, 37 weeks gestation, 41 babies diagnosed with feeding intolerance, 29 were the control group. Infants in both groups had to have never left their incubators. I think this is interesting. This is a study out of China. To be enrolled, you could never have left your incubator because they felt exposure to other microbes would happen as you move throughout the nursery. So these babies never got out of their incubators. They were always in there. Their FI definition, feeding intolerance, gastric residual volume greater than 50%, abdominal distension, regurg, vomiting, emesis, feeding intolerance resolved with the resolution of the symptoms. So, they also did fecal samples in order to do microbial analysis. Those were done within 48 hours of birth, and then again within 24 hours of the diagnosis of feeding intolerance, the clinical diagnosis that they would make. And then again 7 days after feeding intolerance was resolved. They use this 16S rRNA sequencing. It's the same sequencing you use on 23andMe, Ancestry, CSI. It's the basic, it is. It's the same technology that we use in the clinical labs looking at the microbiome. Treatment and combination therapy. They looked at whether or not the babies were receiving probiotics, and if so, which ones. This is very old, or maybe somebody in here as old as me. We used to put, in the good old days, erythromycin down the OG tube. Thank you, Donna! And then we thought, I'll put erythromycin down. That'll help. Not a probiotic, an antibiotic. And they do that some in China. And doses were based, particularly for the probiotics. That's something to remember. If you look at how probiotics are diagnosed in research studies in clinical patients, it is a very elaborate formula. I actually have it on my cheat cards. It's very elaborate, lots of math in that thing. When we're using probiotics these days in our babies, I'm not sure that we're as circumspect as we should be about maybe the diagnosing by what the dose should be, as opposed to just giving them. In this data grouping, what we had here was some significance with the babies who got erythromycin, and also here with the need for longer periods of parental nutrition. Their findings, community composition of the gut microbiota of the preterm infants who had feeding intolerance were greatly altered when feeding intolerance was diagnosed. The microbiome from an emission analysis is one thing. Feeding intolerance, look at it, greatly different in what microorganisms they saw. When feeding intolerance was diagnosed, the comparison of gut microbiota between one group and the other revealed these huge differences. They found that certain microbes that were significantly different in samples were potentially diagnostic markers of feeding intolerance. I'm not sure the answer is that we do microbial studies on gastric aspirin every single shift. I'm not sure that's where we want to go with that. But what they did find in this select group was an aberrant species of Klebsiella that was associated with the feeding intolerance. There was no significant difference between the relative abundance of how much Klebsiella was there between the control group and the feeding intolerance group right after birth. Relative abundant intolerance was significantly higher in that group that was diagnosed with feeding intolerance later on. Therefore, in this study, the proliferation of Klebsiella was possibly related to the occurrence of feeding intolerance. So it gives us a little bit more information to look at. Very few of his own rounds, and Doc says, so what do you think is causing this in this baby? Oh, allergy, volume, the way we're feeding it. Oh, it's microbiome. Just pop that up next time they ask our rounds. This one we're going to go through, this is just a review of physiology of the gut, anatomy of the gut. Remember, in our normal baby, normal peristalsis is a continuous propulsion following feeding of moving food through. Babies, even at term, have irregular peristalsis. Preterm babies have irregular peristalsis and spasming. So the food comes through and it's not propagated on through the bowel as it should. Is that an area of interest? This is just the fact that term infants have different activity than preterm infants. 29 to 32 weeks is a lot of clustering, where boom, 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 I'll move, and then I have this period where I'm not doing anything. Food builds up, is that a little bit of tension that we're seeing? And then it'll get rhythmic again. It's based on the amount and the efficiency that they use a substance called motilin, which is an enzyme that drives in peristaltic waves. So this particular study by Goswami, and I cannot say this second name, is a study that I've read 6 times now. I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand the very deep physiology that they talk about. But what their argument is feeding tolerance got to do with the way we're feeding. Is it bolus or continuous? Does that add to it at all? And most of us at bedside have had that discussion. Either we need to change how we're feeding this baby. Methods between the two groups. These babies were not fed even milk. They were given CLEC special care formula. This was a Canadian study. Designated 50 to 100 grams birth weight category. They had a group that were larger. Any infant whose feeding was withheld, or what they did, for greater than 12 hours, measurable, stopped it for 12 hours, based on the predetermined clinical signs they saw, was considered evidence of FI or feeding intolerance. Okay? So the continuous group reached full enteral feeding, 17.1. The other group at 15 wasn't statistically significant. Days to regain birth weight, not statistically significant. Days to reach discharge weight, didn't seem to matter. This was interesting though. The number of episodes of feeding intolerance was primarily associated with birth weight. The group less than 1,000, the group larger than 1,000. Is that because motilin gets more efficient? Is that because raised get better? At that gestational point, I don't know. But that was the significance they find. They related it to the key factor being what's called enteric neural regulation. That is how the stomach moves food from the antrum to the duodenum, okay, and over. And then those are different patterns depending on your immaturity, how immature you are. And so, again, those phases are the same that we talked about before. But what I want you to see is this. The characteristics of fasting motor activity, no peristaltic waves going on, mature in 10 days to resemble that of term infants, even in the kids less than 1,000 grams. If enteral feeding is commenced irrespective of the gestational age. Remember we talked in our first talk, early feeding. The gut has always been fed. We just have to figure out exactly when and how it wants to be fed. Things normalize with these peristaltic triggers from the enteral feedings. This is my last thing I'll share with you. It's called gut check neck. I mentioned at the beginning. This is Dr. Sheila Gebhardt, been a colleague of mine for years, down at Arizona State University. She's been working on this, I think it's a decade now. She's just a great researcher. Wants to make sure every step of this process that she's doing is being verified. And gut check neck is designed to improve communication about neck at the bedside. So we all agree what we're talking about. Neck risk can facilitate coordination of care among clinicians across the entire expanse of an infant's clinical course. I gave you more slides than I'm showing you, I think, is where here's some flipping pages about. So 35 neonatal experts were brought together to talk about what do you call intolerance? What are your neck risks that you use in your nursery? So she pulled 35 different neonatal experts. They used some de-identified data from pediatrics, a large medical group, warehouse of infant discharges. They looked at over 58,000 babies in that database. Represents composite risk for neck. Then calculate out what's modifiable, neck risk factors. And this website, if you go to it, what a crazy, wonderful woman Sheila Gebhardt is. Everything she knows, everything she has, come and get it. Come and get it. Come and use it. And she has it all there on that wonderful gut check. This would be a great, Donna, this would be a great journal club. I just did this Monday with a group, and I took them all the tools, and we did like a journal club working on it. And this is our first gut check neck scoring sheet for less than 1,500 grams. Again, you can download it and use it. She's got it as a PDF on her website. Okay, I'll read it to you in case you can't see it. Gestational age, race, outborn, neck rate, the neck rate of your own NICU. What's your own NICU's neck rate? Exclusive human milk feeding, probiotics, how many culture-proven infections has the infant had, backdoor blood cell transfusion, hypotension treated with inotropes, metabolic acidosis, and then you score it accordingly. Second one, this is a for neonates, this is the one, then she turns around and puts it on the S-bar. Okay, what's S-bar used for?
Effective communication.
Yeah, change the shift. Remember, she said, I want to get the communication and write it and change the shift. You and I, you're calling and feeding intolerance, and in my head I'm listening and nodding going, not that, it's not feeding intolerance. So S-bar, then how in light of that do I pass to the next shift my sense of the risk of this baby, where he might get neck, but also where he might get intolerance. Okay. Then she has this for all babies, not just less than 1,500 for all of them. And it's a much more detailed 2-page front and back sheet. And again, you can just download the PDF and run them off. And then for all neonates, this is the check sheet for avoiding neck. Things that you should be doing for all babies in your NICU. And puts it there for you to work on. It used to be, the tool is called Gut Check Neck. She has now moved to this Neck Zero thing is what they're doing. And it's been embraced by the Society for the Prevention of Neck, which is a family-driven, very high-focused functioning group looking at eliminating neck in the NICU. And their goal to get there by the says neck is zero. We get neck out of the nursery. Okay? But this is the conclusion on that. 9 independent risk factors she lists in that tool. Okay? And she found 2 independent risk reducers, things that helped. Things that helped again, feeding by day 7, feeding by day 14 on human milk. I didn't say it, she said it, okay? And she added prebiotic exposure. And like I said, I think those studies are coming. But this is the last one I really want you to see. The individual NICU's known neck rate, whatever your neck rate is in your place, carry the most weight in the sum score. And we think it has to do with, it's a combination of practices that aren't capturing something or aren't efficiently treating or preventing something. So what your own neck rate becomes very significant in that. Okay? So feel free to use her tools. Any questions?